Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. From the caves and jungles of Hindostan. God's warrior. The direction of our pilgrimage of self-improvement lay towards the northwest, as was previously decided. We were very impatient to see these status and statue of Anglo-India, but do what you may, there always will be a but. We left the Jabalpur line several miles from Nasik, and, to return to it, we had to go back to Akbarpur, then travel by doubtful local board roads to the station Vanavid, and take the train of Holkar's line, which joins the Great Indian Peninsular Railway. Meanwhile, the Ba Caves were quite close to us, not more than 50 miles off, to the east from Mandu. We were undecided whether to leave them alone or go back to the Narbada. In the country situated on the other side of Khandesh, our Babu had some chums, as everywhere else in India, the omnipresent Bengali babas, who are always glad to be of some service to you, are scattered all over Hindustan, like the Jews in Russia. Besides, our party was joined by a new member. The day before we had received a letter from Swami Dayanand, carried to us by a traveling sannyasi. Dayanand informed us that the cholera was increasing every day in Hardwar, and that we must postpone making his acquaintance personally till the end of May, either in Dehradun, at the foot of Himalaya, or in Saharanpur, which attracts every tourist by its charming situation. The sannyasi brought us also a nosegay from the Swami, a nosegay of the most extraordinary flowers, which are totally unknown in Europe. They grow only in certain Himalayan valleys. They possess the wonderful capacity of changing their color after midday, and do not look dead even when faded. The Latin name of this charming plant is Hibiscus mutabilis. At night they are nothing but a large knot of pressed green leaves, but from dawn till 10 o'clock the flowers open and look like large snow-white roses. Then, towards 12 o'clock, they begin to redden, and later in the afternoon they look as crimson as a peony. These flowers are sacred to the Asuras, a kind of fallen angels in Hindu mythology, and to the sun god Surya. The latter deity fell in love with an Asura at the beginning of creation, and since then is constantly caught whispering words of fiery love to the flower that shelters her. But the Asura is a virgin. She gives herself entirely to the service of the goddess Chastity, who is the patroness of all the ascetic brotherhoods. The love of Surya is vain. Asura will not listen to him. But under the flaming arrows of the enamored god she blushes and in appearance loses her purity. The natives call this plant Lajalu, the modest one. We were spending the night by a brook, under a shadowy fig tree. The sannyasi, who had made a wide circuit to fulfill Dayanand's request, made friends with us, and we sat up late in the night, listening whilst he talked about his travels, the wonders of his native country, once so great, and about the heroic deeds of old Ranjit Singh, the lion of the Punjab. Strange, mysterious beings are found sometimes amongst these traveling monks. Some of them are very learned, read and talk Sanskrit, know all about modern science and politics, and, nevertheless, remain faithful to their ancient philosophical conceptions. Generally they do not wear any clothes, except a piece of muslin round the loins, which is insisted upon by the police of the towns inhabited by Europeans. They wander from the age of 15, all their lives, and die generally very aged. They live never giving a thought to the morrow, like the birds of heaven and the lilies of the field. They never touch money, and are contented with a handful of rice. All their worldly possessions consist of a small dry pumpkin to carry water, a rosary, a brass cup and a walking stick. The sannyasis and the swamis are usually Sikhs from the Punjab and monotheists. They despise idol worshippers and have nothing to do with them, though the latter very often call themselves by their names. Our new friend was a native of Amritsar, in the Punjab, and had been brought up in the Golden Temple, on the banks of Amritasaras, the lake of immortality. The head guru, or instructor, of Sikhs resides there. He never crosses the boundaries of the temple. His chief occupation is the study of the book called Adigrantha, which belongs to the sacred literature of this strange bellicose sect. The Sikhs respect him as much as the Tibetans respect their Dalai Lama. The Lamas in general consider the latter to be the incarnation of Buddha. The Sikhs think that the Mahaguru of Amritsar is the incarnation of Nanak, the founder of their sect. Nevertheless, no true Sikh will ever say that Nanak was a deity. They look on him as a prophet, inspired by the spirit of the only God. This shows that our sannyasi was not one of the naked traveling monks, but a true Akali, one of the 600 warrior priests attached to the Golden Temple, for the purpose of serving God and protecting the temple from the destructive Musulmans. His name was Ram Ranjit Das, and his personal appearance was in perfect accordance with his title of God's warrior. His exterior was very remarkable and typical, and he looked like a muscular centurion of ancient Roman legions, rather than a peaceable servant of the altar. Ram Ranjit Das appeared to us mounted on a magnificent horse and accompanied by another Sikh, who respectfully walked some distance behind him and was evidently passing through his novitiate. Our Hindu companions had discerned that he was an Akali when he was still in the distance. He wore a bright blue tunic without sleeves, exactly like that we see on the statues of Roman warriors. Broad steel bracelets protected his strong arms, and a shield protruded from behind his back. A blue conical turban covered his head, and round his waist were many steel circlets. The enemies of the Sikhs assert that these sacred sectarian belts become more dangerous in the hand of an experienced God's warrior than any other weapon. The Sikhs are the bravest and the most warlike sect of the whole Punjab. The word Sikh means disciple. Founded in the 15th century by the wealthy and noble Brahmin Nanak, the new teaching spread so successfully amongst the northern soldiers that in 1539 AD, when the founder died, it counted 100,000 followers. At the present time, this sect, harmonizing closely with the fiery natural mysticism and the warlike tendencies of the natives, is the reigning creed of the whole Punjab. It is based on the principles of theocratic rule, but its dogmas are almost totally unknown to Europeans. The teachings, the religious conceptions, and the rites of the Sikhs are kept secret. The following details are known generally. The Sikhs are ardent monotheists. They refuse to recognize caste, have no restrictions in diet, like Europeans, and bury their dead, which, except among Muslims, is a rare exception in India. The second volume of the Adigrantha teaches them to adore the only true God, to avoid superstitions, to help the dead, that they may lead a righteous life, and to earn one's living, sword in hand. Govinda, one of the great gurus of the Sikhs, ordered them never to shave their beards and mustaches, and not to cut their hair in order that they may not be mistaken for Mussulmans or any other native of India. Many a desperate battle the Sikhs fought and won, against the Mussulmans, and against the Hindus. Their leader, the celebrated Ranjit Singh, after having been acknowledged the autocrat of the Upper Punjab, concluded a treaty with Lord Auckland at the beginning of this century, in which his country was proclaimed an independent state. But after the death of the old lion, his throne became the cause of the most dreadful civil wars and disorders. His son, Maharaja Dulip Singh, proved quite unfit for the high post he inherited from his father, and, under him, the Sikhs became an ill-disciplined, restless mob. Their attempt to conquer the whole of Hindostan proved disastrous. Persecuted by his own soldiers, Dulip Singh sought the help of Englishmen and was sent away to Scotland. And some time after this, the Sikhs took their place amongst the rest of Britain's Indian subjects. But still there remains a strong body of the great Sikh sect of old. The Kuks represent the most dangerous underground current of the popular hatred. This new sect was founded about 30 years ago, written in 1879 by Balaka Rama, and, at first, formed a bulk of people near Attock, in the Punjab, on the east bank of the Indus, exactly on the spot where the latter becomes navigable. Balaka Rama had a double aim: to restore the religion of the Sikhs to its pristine purity, and to organize a secret political body, which must be ready for everything, at a moment's notice. This brotherhood consists of 60,000 members, who pledged themselves never to reveal their secrets and never to disobey any order of their leaders. In Attock they are few, for the town is small. But we were assured that the Kuks live everywhere in India. Their community is so perfectly organized that it is impossible to find them out or to learn the names of their leaders. In the course of the evening, our Akali presented us with a little crystal bottle filled with water from the lake of immortality. He said that a drop of it would cure all diseases of the eye. There are numbers of fresh springs at the bottom of this lake, and so its water is wonderfully pure and transparent, in spite of hundreds of people daily bathing in it. When, later on, we visited it, we had the opportunity to verify the fact that the smallest stone at the bottom is seen perfectly distinctly all over the 150 square yards of the lake. Amritsar is the most charming of all the sights of northern India. The reflection of the Golden Temple in its crystal waters makes a picture that is simply féerique. We had still 7 weeks at our disposal. We were undecided between exploring the Bombay Presidency, the Northwest Provinces, and the Rajasthan. Which were we to choose? Where were we to go? How best to employ our time? Before such a variety of interesting places we became irresolute. Hyderabad, which is said to transport the tourists into the scenery of the Arabian Nights, seemed so attractive that we seriously thought of turning our elephants back to the territory of the Nizam. We grew fond of the idea of visiting this city of the lion, which was built in 1589 by the magnificent Muhammad Quli Quth Shah, who was so used to luxuries of every kind as to grow weary even of Golconda, with all its fairyland castles and bright gardens. Some buildings of Hyderabad, mere remnants of the past glory, are still known to renown. Mir Abu Talib, the keeper of the royal treasury, states that Muhammad Quli Shah spent the fabulous sum of 2,800,000 lira sterling on the embellishment of the town at the beginning of his reign, though the labor of the workmen did not cost him anything at all. Save these few memorials of greatness, the town looks like a heap of rubbish nowadays. But all tourists are unanimous on one point, namely, that the British Residency of Hyderabad still deserves its title of the Versailles of India. The title the British Residency bears, and everything it may contain at the present time, are mere trifles compared with the past. I remember reading a chapter of the history of Hyderabad by an English author, which contained something to the following effect. Whilst the resident entertained the gentleman, his wife was similarly employed receiving the ladies a few yards off, in a separate palace, which was as sumptuous and bore the name of Rang Mahal. Both palaces were built by Colonel Kirkpatrick, the late minister at the Nizam's court. Having married a native princess, he constructed this charming abode for her personal use. Its garden is surrounded by a high wall, as is customary in the Orient, and the center of the garden is adorned with a large marble fountain, covered with scenes from the Ramayana, and mosaics, pavilions, galleries and terraces. Everything in this garden is loaded with adornments of the most costly Oriental style, that is to say, with abundance of inlaid designs, paintings, gilding, ivory and marble. The great attraction of Mrs. Kirkpatrick's receptions were the notches, magnificently dressed, thanks to the generosity of the resident. Some of them wore a cargo of jewels worth 30,000 lira, and literally shone from head to foot with diamonds and other precious stones. The glorious times of the East India Company are beyond recall, and no residents, and even no native princes, could now afford to be so generous. India, this most precious diamond of the British crown, is utterly exhausted, like a pile of gold in the hands of an alchemist, who thriftlessly spent it in the hope of finding the philosopher's stone. Besides ruining themselves and the country, the Anglo-Indians commit the greatest blunders, at least in 2 points of their present government system. These 2 points are: first, the Western education they give to the higher classes, and, secondly, the protection and maintenance of the rites of idol worship. Neither of these systems is wise. By means of the first they successfully replace the religious feelings of old India, which, however false, had the great advantage of being sincere, by a positive atheism amongst a young generation of the Brahmins, and by the means of the second, they flatter only the ignorant masses, from whom nothing is to be feared under any circumstances. If the patriotic feelings of the bulk of the population could possibly be roused, the English would have been slaughtered long ago. The rural populace is unarmed, it is true, but a crowd seeking revenge could use the brass and stone idols, sent to India by thousands from Birmingham, with as great success as if they were so many swords. But, as it is, the masses of India are indifferent and harmless, so that the only existing danger comes from the side of the educated classes. And the English fail to see that the better the education they give them, the more careful they must be to avoid reopening the old wounds, always alive to new injury, in the heart of every true Hindu. The Hindus are proud of the past of their country. Dreams of past glories are their only compensation for the bitter present. The English education they receive only enables them to learn that Europe was plunged in the darkness of the Stone Age, when India was in the full growth of her splendid civilization. And so the comparison of their past with their present is only the more sad. This consideration never hinders the Anglo-Indians from hurting the feelings of the Hindus. For instance, in the unanimous opinion of travelers and antiquarians, the most interesting building of Hyderabad is Chahar Minor, a college that was built by Muhammad Quli Khan on the ruins of a still more ancient college. It is built at the crossing of 4 streets, on 4 arches, which are so high that loaded camels and elephants with their turrets pass through freely. Over these arches rise the several stories of the college. Each story once was destined for a separate branch of learning. Alas! The times when India studied philosophy and astronomy at the feet of her great sages are gone, and the English have transformed the college itself into a warehouse. The hall, which served for the study of astronomy and was filled with quaint medieval apparatus, is now used for a depot of opium, and the hall of philosophy contains huge boxes of liqueurs, rum and champagne, which are prohibited by the Quran, as well as by the Brahmins. We were so enchanted by what we heard about Hyderabad that we resolved to start thither the very next morning, when our cicerone and companions destroyed all our plans by a single word. This word was heat. During the hot season in Hyderabad, the thermometer reaches 98 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, and the temperature of the water in the Indus is the temperature of the blood. As to Upper Sindh, where the dryness of the air and the extreme aridity of the sandy soil reproduce the Sahara in miniature, the usual shade temperature is 130 degrees Fahrenheit. No wonder the missionaries have no chance there. The most eloquent of Dante's descriptions of hell could hardly produce anything but a cooling effect on a populace who live perfectly contented under these circumstances. Calculating that there was no obstacle to our going to the Ba caves, and that going to Sindh was a perfect impossibility, we recovered our equanimity. Then the General Council decided that we had better abandon all ideas of a predetermined plan and travel as fancy led us. We dismissed our elephants and next day, a little before sunset, arrived at the spot where the Vagri and Gurna join. These are two little rivers, quite famous in the annals of the Indian mythology, and which are generally conspicuous by their absence, especially in summer. At the opposite side of the river, there lay the illustrious Ba caves, with their 4 openings blinking in the thick evening mist. We thought of crossing to them immediately, by the help of a ferry boat, but our Hindu friends and the boatmen interposed. The former said that visiting these caves is dangerous even by daytime, because all the neighborhood is full of beasts of prey and of tigers, who, I concluded, are like the Bengali babas, to be met with everywhere in India. Before venturing into these caves, you must send a reconnoitering party of torch-bearers and armed shikaris. As to the boatmen, they protested on different grounds, but protested strongly. They said that no Hindu would dare to approach these caves after the sunset. No one but a Balati would fancy that Vagri and Gurna are ordinary rivers, for every Hindu knows they are divine spouses, the god Shiva and his wife Parvati. This, in the first instance, and in the second, the Ba tigers are no ordinary tigers either. The Sahibs are totally mistaken. These tigers are the servants of the sadhus, of the holy miracle workers, who have haunted the caves now for many centuries, and who deign sometimes to take the shape of a tiger. And neither the gods, nor the sadhus, nor the glamour, nor the true tigers are fond of being disturbed in their nightly rest. What could we say against all this? We cast one more sorrowful look at the caves and returned to our antediluvian carriages. The Babu and Narayan said we must spend the night at the house of a certain chum of the Babu, who resided in a small town 3 miles further on, and bearing the same name as the caves, and we unwillingly acquiesced. Many things in India are wonderful and unintelligible, but one of the most wonderful and the most unintelligible is the geographical and the topographical disposition of the numberless territories of this country. Political conjunctures in India seem to be everlastingly playing the French game casse-tête, changing the pattern, diminishing one part and adding to another. The land that only yesterday belonged to this Raj or that Thakur is sure to be found today in the hands of quite a different set of people. For instance, we were in the Raj of Amjad in Malva, and we were going to the little city of Ba, which also belongs to Malva and is included in the Amjad Raj. In the documents, Malva is included in the independent possessions of Holkar, and nevertheless the Amjad Raj does not belong to Tukujirao Holkar, but to the son of the independent Raja of Amjad, who was hanged by inadvertence, as we were assured, in 1857. The city and the caves of Ba very oddly belong to the Maharaja Sindhu of Gwalior, who, besides, does not own them personally, having made a kind of present of them and their 9,000 rupees of revenue to some poor relation. This poor relation, in his turn, does not enjoy the property in the least, because a certain Rajput Thakur stole it from him and will not consent to give it back. Ba is situated on the road from Gujarat to Malva, in the defile of Udaipur, which is owned accordingly by the Maharana of Udaipur. Ba itself is built on the top of a woody hillock, and being disputed property does not belong to any one in particular, properly speaking, but a small fortress and a bazaar in the center of it are the private possessions of a certain Dani, who, besides being the chieftain of the Bamala tribe, was the personal chum of our Babu and a great thief and highway robber, according to the assertions of the said Babu. But why do you intend taking us to the place of a man whom you consider as a thief and a robber? Objected one of us timidly. He is a thief and a brigand, coolly answered the Bengali, but only in the political sense. Otherwise he is an excellent man and the truest of friends. Besides, if he does not help us, we shall starve. The bazaar and everything in the shops belong to him. These explanations of the Babu notwithstanding, we were glad to learn that the chum in question was absent, and we were received by a relation of his. The garden was put at our disposal, and before our tents were pitched, we saw people coming from every side of the garden, bringing us provisions. Having deposited what he had brought, each of them, on leaving the tent, threw over his shoulder a pinch of betel and soft sugar, an offering to the foreign Buddhas, which were supposed to accompany us wherever we went. The Hindus of our party asked us, very seriously, not to laugh at this performance, saying it would be dangerous in this out-of-the-way place. No doubt they were right. We were in central India, the very nest of all kinds of superstitions, and were surrounded by bills. All along the Vindhya ridge, from Yama, on the west of the Dead City, the country is thickly populated by this most daring, restless and superstitious of all the half-savage tribes of India. The Orientalists think that the naive bills comes from the Sanskrit root bid, which means to separate. Sir J. Malcolm supposes accordingly that the bills are sectarians who separated from the Brahmanical creed and were excommunicated. All this looks very probable, but their tribal traditions say something different. Of course, in this case, as in every other, their history is strongly entangled with mythology, and one has to go through a thick shrubbery of fancy before reaching the tribe's genealogical tree. The relation of the absent Dani, who spent the evening with us, told us the following. The Bills are the descendants of one of the sons of Mahadeva, or Shiva, and of a fair woman, with blue eyes and a white face, whom he met in some forest on the other side of the Kalapani, black waters, or ocean. This pair had several sons, one of whom, as handsome as he was vicious, killed the favorite ox of his grandfather Mahadeva and was banished by his father to the Jodhpur desert. Banished to its remotest southern corner, he married, and soon his descendants filled the whole country. They scattered along the Vindhya ridge, on the western frontier of Malva and Khandesh, and, later, in the woody wilderness, on the shores of the rivers Maha, Narmada and Tapti. And all of them, inheriting the beauty of their forefather, his blue eyes and fair complexion, inherited also his turbulent disposition and his vice. "We are thieves and robbers," naively explained the relative of the babu's chum, "but we can't help it, because this is the decree of our mighty forefather, the great Mahadeva Shiva." Sending his grandson to repent his sins in the desert, he said to him, "Go, wretched murderer of my son and your brother, the ox Nardi, go and live the life of an exile and a brigand, to be an everlasting warning to your brethren." These are the very words of the great God. Now, do you think we could disobey his orders? The least of our actions is always regulated by our Bamyas chieftains, who are the direct descendants of Nader Singh, the first Bill, the child of our exiled ancestor, and being this, it is only natural that the great God speaks to us through him. Is not it strange that Apis, the sacred ox of the Egyptians, is honored by the followers of Zoroaster, as well as by the Hindus? The ox Nardi, the emblem of life in nature, is the son of the creating Father, or rather his life-giving breath. Ammianus Marcellinus mentions, in one of his works, that there exists a book which gives the exact age of Apis, the clue to the mystery of creation and the cyclic calculations. The Brahmins also explain the allegory of the ox Nardi by the continuation of life on our globe. The mediators between Shiva and the Bills possess such unrestricted authority that the most awful crimes are accomplished at their lightest word. The tribe have thought it necessary to decrease their power to a certain extent by instituting a kind of council in every village. This council is called Tarvi and tries to cool down the hot-headed fancies of the Danis, their brigand lords. However, the word of the Bills is sacred and their hospitality is boundless. The history and the annals of the princes of Jodhpur and Udaipur confirm the legend of the Bill immigration from their primitive desert, but how they happened to be there nobody knows. Colonel Todd is positive that the Bills, together with the Marises and the Goans, are the Aborigines of India, as well as the tribes who inhabit the Nerbudda forests. But why the Bills should be almost fair and blue-eyed, whereas the rest of the hill tribes are almost African in type, is a question that is not answered by this statement. The fact that all these Aborigines call themselves Bhumiputra and Vanaputra, sons of the earth and sons of the forest, when the Rajputs, their first conquerors, call themselves Suryavansav and the Brahmins Induputras, descendants of the sun and the moon, does not prove everything. It seems to me that in the present case, their appearance, which confirms their legends, is of much greater value than philology. Dr. Clark, the author of Travels in Scandinavia, is very logical in saying that, by directing our attention on the traces of the ancient superstitions of a tribe, we shall find out who were its primitive forefathers much more easily than by scientific examination of their tongue. The superstitions are grafted on the very root, whereas the tongue is subjected to all kinds of changes. But, unfortunately, everything we know about the history of the Bills is reduced to the above-mentioned tradition, and to a few ancient songs of their bards. These bards or Battas live in Rajasthan, but visit the Bills yearly in order not to lose the leading thread of the achievements of their countrymen. Their songs are history because the Battas have existed from time immemorial, compassing their lays for future generations, for this is their hereditary duty. And the songs of the remotest antiquity point to the lands over the Kalapani as the place whence the Bills came, that is to say, some place in Europe. Some Orientalists, especially Colonel Todd, seek to prove that the Rajputs, who conquered the Bills, were newcomers of Scythian origin, and that the Bills are the true aborigines. To prove this, they put forward some features common to both peoples, Rajput and Scythian, for instance, 1. The worship of the sword, the lance, the shield and the horse, 2. The worship of, and the sacrifice to, the sun, which, as far as I know, never was worshipped by the Scythians, 3. The passion of gambling, which again is as strong amongst the Chinese and the Japanese, 4. The custom of drinking blood out of the skull of an enemy, which is also practiced by some aborigines of America, etc., etc. I do not intend entering here on a scientific ethnological discussion, and, besides, I am sure no one fails to see that the reasoning of scientists sometimes takes a very strange turn when they set to prove some favorite theory of theirs. It is enough to remember how entangled and obscure is the history of the ancient Scythians to abstain from drawing any positive conclusions whatsoever from it. The tribes that go under one general denomination of Scythians were many, and still it is impossible to deny that there is a good deal of similitude between the customs of the old Scandinavians, worshippers of Aten, whose land indeed was occupied by the Scythians more than 500 years BC, and the customs of the Rajputs. But this similitude gives as much right to the Rajputs to say that we are a colony of Suryavansas settled in the west, as to us to maintain that the Rajputs are the descendants of Scythians who emigrated to the east. The Scythians of Herodotus and the Scythians of Ptolemy, and some other classical writers, are two perfectly distinct nationalities. Under Scythia, Herodotus means the extension of land from the mouth of Danube to the Sea of Azov, according to Niebuhr, and to the mouth of Don, according to Rawlinson, whereas the Scythia of Ptolemy is a country strictly Asiatic, including the whole space between the river Volga and Serica, or China. Besides this, Scythia was divided by the western Himalayas, which the Roman writers call Imos, into Scythia intra-Imam and Scythia extra-Imam. Given this lack of precision, the Rajputs may be called the Scythians of Asia, and the Scythians the Rajputs of Europe, with the same degree of likelihood. Pinkerton's opinion is that European contempt for the Tartars would not be half so strong if the European public learned how closely we are related to them, that our forefathers came from northern Asia, and that our primitive customs, laws and mode of living were the same as theirs, in a word, that we are nothing but a Tartar colony. Cimbri, Celts and Gauls, who conquered the northern part of Europe, are different names of the same tribe, whose origin is Tartary. Who were the Goths, the Swedes, the Vandals, the Huns and the Franks, if not separate swarms of the same beehive? The annals of Sweden point to Kashgar as the fatherland of the Swedes. The likeness between the languages of the Saxons and the Kipchak Tartars is striking, and the Celtic, which still exists in Brittany and in Wales, is the best proof that their inhabitants are descendants of the Tartar nation. Whatever Pinkerton and others may say, The modern Rajput warriors do not answer in the least the description Hippocrates gives us of the Scythians. The father of medicine says, "The bodily structure of these men is thick, coarse and stunted, their joints are weak and flabby, they have almost no hair, and each of them resembles the other." No man who has seen the handsome, gigantic warriors of Rajasthan, with their abundant hair and beards, will ever recognize this portrait drawn by Hippocrates as theirs. Besides, the Scythians, whoever they may be, buried their dead, which the Rajputs never did, judging by the records of their most ancient MSS. The Scythians were a wandering nation and are described by Hesiod as living in covered carts and feeding on mare's milk. And the Rajputs have been a sedentary people from time immemorial, inhabiting towns and having their history at least several hundred years before Christ, that is to say, earlier than the epoch of Herodotus. They do celebrate the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice, but will not touch mare's milk and despise all Mongolians. Herodotus says that the Scythians, who called themselves Skaloti, hated foreigners and never let any stranger in their country, and the Rajputs are one of the most hospitable peoples of the world. In the epoch of the Wars of Darius, 516 BC, the Scythians were still in their own district, about the mouth of the Danube. And at the same epoch the Rajputs were already known in India and had their own kingdom. As to the Ashvamedha, which Colonel Todd thinks to be the chief illustration of his theory, the custom of killing horses in honor of the sun is mentioned in the Rig Veda as well as in the Aitareya Brahmana. Martin Hogg states that the latter has probably been in existence since 2400 BC. But it strikes me that the digression from the Babus Chum to the Scythians and the Rajputs of the antediluvian epoch threatens to become too long, so I beg the reader's pardon and resume the thread of my narrative. The banns of marriage. Next day, early in the morning, the local shikaris went under the leadership of the warlike Akali to hunt glamoured and real tigers in the caves. It took them longer than we expected. The old Bill, who represented to us the absent Ani, proposed that in the meanwhile we should witness a Brahmanical wedding ceremony. Needless to say, we jumped at this. The ceremonies of betrothal and marriage have not changed in India during the last 2 millenniums at least. They are performed according to the directions of Manu, and the old theme has no new variations. India's religious rites have crystallized long ago. Whoever has seen a Hindu wedding in 1879 saw it as it was celebrated in ancient Aryavarta many centuries ago. A few days before we left Bombay, we read in a small local newspaper 2 announcements of marriages. The first, the marriage of a Brahmin heiress, the second of a daughter of the fire worshippers. The first announcement was something to the following effect: "The family of Bimbam of Lankar, etc., etc., are preparing for a happy event. This respectable member of our community, unlike the rest of the less fortunate Brahmins of his caste, has found a husband for his granddaughter in a rich Gujarat family of the same caste. The little Ramabai is already 5, her future husband is 7. The wedding is to take place in 2 months and promises to be brilliant." The second announcement referred to an accomplished fact. It appeared in a Parsi paper, which strongly insists on the necessity of giving up disgusting superannuated customs, and especially the early marriage. It justly ridiculed a certain Gujarati newspaper, which had just described in very pompous expressions a recent wedding ceremony in Pune. The bridegroom, who had just entered his 6th year, pressed to his heart a blushing bride of 2.5. The usual answers of this couple entering into matrimony proved so indistinct that the mob had to address the questions to their parents. Are you willing to have him for your lawful husband, O daughter of Zarathustra? And are you willing to be her husband, O son of Zoroaster? Everything went as well as it could be expected. Continued the newspaper. The bridegroom was led out of the room by the hand, and the bride, who was carried away in arms, greeted the guests, not with smiles, but with a tremendous howl, which made her forget the existence of such a thing as a pocket handkerchief, and remember only her feeding bottle. For the latter article she asked repeatedly, half choked with sobs, and throttled with the weight of the family diamonds. Taking it all in all, it was a Parsi marriage, which shows the progress of our speedily developing nation, with the exactitude of a weather glass, added the satirical newspaper. Having read this, we laughed heartily, though we did not give full credit to this description, and thought it a good deal exaggerated. We knew Parsi and Brahmin families in which were husbands of 10 years of age, but had never heard as yet of a bride who was a baby in arms. It is not without reason that the Brahmins are fervent upholders of the ancient law which prohibits to everyone, except the officiating Brahmins, the study of Sanskrit and the reading of the Vedas. The Shudras and even the high-born Vaishyas were in olden times to be executed for such an offense. The secret of this rigor lies in the fact that the Vedas do not permit matrimony for women under 15 to 20 years of age, and for men under 25, or even 30. Eager above all that every religious ceremony should fill their pockets, the Brahmins never stopped at disfiguring their ancient sacred literature, and not to be caught, they pronounced its study accursed. Amongst other criminal inventions, to use the expression of Swami Dayanand, there is a text in the Brahmanical books which contradicts everything that is to be found in the Vedas on this particular matter. I speak of the Kudva Kunbas, the wedding season of all the agricultural classes of Central Asia. This season is to be celebrated once in every 12 years. But it appears to be a field from which messieurs les Brahmins gathered the most abundant harvest. At this epoch, all the mothers have to seek audiences from the goddess Mata, the great mother, of course, through her rightful oracles, the Brahmins. Mata is the special patroness of all the 4 kinds of marriages practiced in India. The marriages of adults, of children, of babies, and of specimens of humanity that are as yet to be born. The latter is the queerest of all, because the feelings it excites are so very like gambling. In this case, the marriage ceremony is celebrated between the mothers of the future children. Many a curious incident is the result of these matrimonial parodies. But a true Brahmin will never allow the derision of fate to shake his dignity, and the docile population never will doubt the infallibility of these elect of the gods. An open antagonism to the Brahmanical institutions is more than rare. The feelings of reverence and dread the masses show to the Brahmins are so blind and so sincere that an outsider cannot help smiling at them and respecting them at the same time. If both the mothers have children of the same sex, it will not upset the Brahmin in the least. He will say this was the will of the goddess Mata. It shows that she desires the newborn babies to be 2 loving brothers, or 2 loving sisters, as the case may be, in future. And if the children grow up, they will be acknowledged heirs to the properties of both mothers. In this case, the Brahmin breaks the bonds of the marriage by the order of the goddess, is paid for doing so, and the whole affair is dropped altogether. But if the children are of different sexes, these bonds cannot be broken, even if they are born cripples or idiots. While I am dealing with the family life of India, I had better mention some other features, not to return to them anymore. No Hindu has the right to remain single. The only exceptions are, in case the child is destined to monastic life from the first days of his existence, and in case the child is consecrated to the service of one of the gods of the Trimurti, even before he is born. Religion insists on matrimony for the sake of having a son, whose duty it will be to perform every prescribed rite, in order that his departed father may enter Swarga, or paradise. Even the caste of brahmacharyas, who take vows of chastity, but take a part and interest in worldly life, and so are the unique lay celibates of India, are bound to adopt sons. The rest of the Hindus must remain in matrimony till the age of 40, after which they earn the right to leave the world and to seek salvation, leading an ascetic life in some jungle. If a member of some Hindu family happens to be afflicted from birth with some organic defect, this will not be an impediment to his marrying, on the condition that his wife should be also a cripple, if she belongs to the same caste. The defects of husband and wife must be different. If he is blind, she must be hump-backed or lame, and vice versa. But if the young man in question is prejudiced and wants a healthy wife, he must condescend to make a mésalliance. He must stoop to choose a wife in a caste that is exactly 1 degree lower than his own. But in this case his kinsmen and associates will not acknowledge her. The parvenu will not be received on any conditions whatever. Besides, all these exceptional instances depend entirely on the family guru, on the priest who is inspired by the gods. All the above holds good as far as the men are concerned, but with the women it is quite different. Only the Nachas dancing girls consecrated to gods and living in temples can be said to be free and happy. Their occupation is hereditary, but they are Vestals and daughters of Vestals, however strange this may sound to a European ear. But the notions of the Hindus, especially on questions of morality, are quite independent and even anti-Western, if I may use this expression. No one is more severe and exacting in the questions of feminine honor and chastity, but the Brahmins proved to be more cunning than even the Roman augurs. Ray Silvia, for instance, the mother of Romulus and Remus, was buried alive by the ancient Romans, in spite of the god Mars taking an active part in her faux pas. Numa and Tiberius took exceedingly good care that the good morals of their priestesses should not become merely nominal. But the Vestals on the banks of the Ganges and the Indus understand the question differently from those on the banks of the Tiber. The intimacy of the Nach girls with the gods, which is generally accepted, cleanses them from every sin and makes them in everyone's eyes irreproachable and infallible. A Nacha cannot sin, in spite of the crowd of the celestial musicians who swarm in every pagoda, in the form of baby Vestals and their little brothers. No virtuous Roman matron was ever so respected as the pretty little Nacha. This great reverence for the happy brides of the gods is especially striking in the purely native towns of central India, where the population has preserved intact their blind faith in the Brahmins. Every Nacha can read and receives the highest Hindu education. They all read and write in Sanskrit and study the best literature of ancient India and her 6 chief philosophies, but especially music, singing and dancing. Besides these god-born priestesses of the pagodas, there are also public Nachas, who, like the Egyptian Almias, are within the reach of ordinary mortals, not only of gods, they also are in most cases women of a certain culture. But the fate of an honest woman of Hindostan is quite different, and a bitter and incredibly unjust fate it is. The life of a thoroughly good woman, especially if she happens to possess warm faith and unshaken piety, is simply a long chain of fatal misfortunes. And the higher her family and social position, the more wretched is her life. Married women are so afraid of resembling the professional dancing girls that they cannot be persuaded to learn anything the latter are taught. If a Brahmin woman is rich, her life is spent in demoralizing idleness. If she is poor, so much the worse. Her earthly existence is concentrated in monotonous performances of mechanical rites. There is no past and no future for her, only a tedious present, from which there is no possible escape. And this only if everything be well, if her family be not visited by sad losses. Needless to say that, amongst Brahmin women, marriage is not a question of free choice, and still less of affection. Her choice of a husband is restricted by the caste to which her father and mother happen to belong, and so, to find a suitable match for a girl is a matter of great difficulty, as well as of great expense. In India, the high caste woman is not bought, but she has to buy the right to get married. Accordingly, the birth of a girl is not a joy, but a sorrow, especially if her parents are not rich. She must be married not later than when she is 7 or 8. A little girl of 10 is an old maid in India. She is a discredit to her parents and is the miserable butt of all her more fortunate contemporaries. One of the few noble achievements of Englishmen in India which have succeeded is the decrease of infanticide, which some time ago was a daily practice and still is not quite got rid of. Little girls were killed by their parents everywhere in India, but this dreadful custom was especially common amongst the tribes of Jadaj, once so powerful in Sindh, and now reduced to petty brigandage. Probably these tribes were the first to spread this heartless practice. Obligatory marriage for little girls is a comparatively recent invention, and it alone is responsible for the parents' decision rather to see them dead than unmarried. The ancient Aryans knew nothing of it. Even the ancient Brahmanical literature shows that, amongst the pure Aryans, woman enjoyed the same privileges as man. Her voice was listened to by the statesman. She was free either to choose a husband or to remain single. Many a woman's name plays an important part in the chronicles of the ancient Aryan land. Many women have come down to posterity as eminent poets, astronomers, philosophers, and even sages and lawyers. But with the invasion of the Persians in the 7th century, and later on of the fanatical, all-destroying Mussulmans, all this changed. Woman became enslaved, and the Brahmins did everything to humiliate her. In towns, the position of the Hindu woman is still worse than amongst agricultural classes. The wedding ceremonies are very complicated and numerous. They are divided into 3 groups. The rites before the wedding, the rites during the ceremony, and the rites after the celebration has taken place. The first group consists of 11 ceremonies. The asking in marriage, the comparison of the 2 horoscopes, the sacrifice of a goat, the fixing of a propitious day, the building of the altar, the purchase of the sacred pots for household use, the invitation of guests, the sacrifices to the household gods, mutual presents, and so on. All this must be accomplished as a religious duty and is full of entangled rites. As soon as a little girl in some Hindu family is 4 years old, Her father and mother sent for the family guru, give him her horoscope, drawn up previously by the astrologer of their caste, a very important post, and send the guru to this or that inhabitant of the place, who is known to have a son of appropriate age. The father of the little boy has to put the horoscope on the altar before the family gods and to answer, "I am well disposed towards the panagrana, let Rudra help us." The guru must ask when the union is to take place, after which he is bowed out. A few days later the father of the little boy takes the horoscope of his son, as well as of the little girl, to the chief astrologer. If the latter finds them propitious to the intended marriage, it will take place. If not, his decision is immediately sent to the father of the little girl, and the whole affair is dropped. If the astrologer's opinion is favorable, however, the bargain is concluded on the spot. The astrologer offers a cocoa nut and a handful of sugar to the father, after which nothing can be altered, otherwise a Hindu vendetta will be handed down from generation to generation. After the obligatory goat sacrifice, the couple are irrevocably betrothed, and the astrologer fixes the day of the wedding. The sacrifice of the goat is very interesting, so I am going to describe it in detail. A child of the male sex is sent to invite several married ladies, old women of 20 or 25, to witness the worship of the lares and peanuts. Each family has a household goddess of its own, which is not impossible, since the Hindu gods number 33 crores. On the eve of the sacrificial day, a kid is brought into the house, and all the family sleep round him. Next morning, the reception hall in the lower story is made ready for the ceremony. The floor is thickly covered with cow dung, and, right in the middle of the room, a square is traced with white chalk, in which is placed a high pedestal, with the statue of the goddess. The patriarch of the family brings the goat and, holding him by the horns, lowers his head to salute the goddess. After this, the old and young women sing marriage hymns, tie the legs of the goat, cover his head with red powder, and make a lamp smoke under his nose to banish the evil spirits from round him. When all this is done, the female element puts itself out of the way, and the patriarch comes again upon the stage. He treacherously puts a ration of rice before the goat, and as soon as the victim becomes innocently absorbed in gratifying his appetite, the old man chops his head off with a single stroke of his sword and bathes the goddess in the smoking blood coming from the head of the animal, which he holds in his right arm, over the idol. The women sing in chorus, and the ceremony of betrothal is over. The ceremonies with the astrologers and the exchange of presents are too long to be described. I shall mention only that in all these ceremonies the astrologer plays the double part of an augur and a family lawyer. After a general invocation to the elephant-headed god Ganesha, the marriage contract is written on the reverse of the horoscopes and sealed, and a general blessing is pronounced over the assembly. Needless to say that all these ceremonies had been accomplished long ago in the family to whose marriage party we were invited in Ba. All these rites are sacred, and most probably we, being mere strangers, would not have been allowed to witness them. We saw them all later on in Benares thanks to the intercession of our Babu. When we arrived on the spot where the Ba ceremony was celebrated, the festivity was at its height. The bridegroom was not more than 14 years old, while the bride was only 10. Her small nose was adorned with a huge golden ring with some very brilliant stone, which dragged her nostril down. Her face looked comically piteous, and sometimes she cast furtive glances at us. The bridegroom, a stout, healthy-looking boy, attired in cloth of gold and wearing the many-storied Indra hat, was on horseback, surrounded by a whole crowd of male relations. The altar, especially erected for this occasion, presented a queer sight. Its regulation height is 3 times the length of the bride's arm from the shoulder down to the middle finger. Its materials are bricks and whitewashed clay. 46 earthen pots painted with red, yellow and green stripes, the colors of the Trimurti, rose in 2 pyramids on both sides of the god of marriages on the altar, and all round it, a crowd of little married girls were busy grinding ginger. When it was reduced to powder, the whole crowd rushed on the bridegroom, dragged him from his horse, and, having undressed him, began rubbing him with wet ginger. As soon as the sun dried him, he was dressed again by some of the little ladies, whilst one part of them sang, and the other sprinkled his head with water from lotus leaves twisted into tubes. We understood that this was a delicate attention to the water gods. We were also told that the whole of the previous night had been given up to the worship of various spirits. The last rites, begun weeks ago, were hurriedly brought to an end during this last night. Invocations to Ganesha, to the god of marriages, to the gods of the elements, water, fire, air and earth, to the goddess of the smallpox and other illnesses, to the spirits of ancestors and planetary spirits, to the evil spirits, good spirits, family spirits, and so on, and so on. Suddenly our ears were struck by strains of music. Good heavens! What a dreadful symphony it was. The ear-splitting sounds of Indian tom-toms, Tibetan drunas, Sinhalese pipes, Chinese trumpets, and Burmese gongs deafened us on all sides, awakening in our souls hatred for humanity and humanity's inventions. De tous les bruits du monde celui de la musique est le plus désagréable, was my ever-recurring thought. Happily, this agony did not last long and was replaced by the choral singing of Brahmins and Nachas, which was very original, but perfectly bearable. The wedding was a rich one, and so the Vestals appeared in state. A moment of silence, of restrained whispering, and one of them, a tall, handsome girl with eyes literally filling half her forehead, began approaching one guest after the other in perfect silence and rubbing their faces with her hand, leaving traces of sandal and saffron powders. She glided towards us also, noiselessly moving over the dusty road with her bare feet, and before we realized what she was doing, she had daubed me as well as the Colonel and Miss X, which made the latter sneeze and wipe her face for at least 10 minutes, with loud but vain utterances of indignation. The Babu and Mulji offered their faces to the little hand, full of saffron, with smiles of condescending generosity. But the indomitable Narayan shrank from the Vestal so unexpectedly at the precise moment when, with fiery glances at him, she stood on tiptoe to reach his face, that she quite lost countenance and sent a full dose of powder over his shoulder, whilst he turned away from her with knitted brow. Her forehead also showed several threatening lines, but in a moment she overcame her anger and glided towards Ram Ranjit Das, sparkling with engaging smiles. But here she met with still less luck. Offended at once in his monotheism and his chastity, the god's warrior pushed the Vestal so unceremoniously that she nearly upset the elaborate pot decoration of the altar. A dissatisfied murmur ran through the crowd, and we were preparing to be condemned to shameful banishment for the sins of the warlike Sikh, when the drums sounded again and the procession moved on. In front of everyone drove the trumpeters and the drummers in a car gilded from top to bottom and dragged by bullocks loaded with garlands of flowers. Next after them walked a whole detachment of pipers, and then a third body of musicians on horseback, who frantically hammered huge gongs. After them proceeded the cortege of the bridegrooms and the bride's relations on horses, adorned with rich harness, feathers and flowers. They went in pairs. They were followed by a regiment of bills in full disarmor because no weapons, but bows and arrows had been left to them by the English government. All these bills looked as if they had toothache, because of the odd way they have of arranging the ends of their white pagras. After them walked clerical Brahmins, with aromatic tapers in their hands and surrounded by the flitting battalion of notches, who amused themselves all the way by graceful glissades and pas. They were followed by the lay Brahmins, the twice-born. The bridegroom rode on a handsome horse. On both sides walked two couples of warriors, armed with yak's tails to wave the flies away. They were accompanied by two more men on each side with silver fans. The bridegroom's group was wound up by a naked Brahmin, perched on a donkey and holding over the head of the boy a huge red silk umbrella. After him a car loaded with 1,000 cocoa nuts and 100 bamboo baskets, tied together by a red rope. The god who looks after marriages drove in melancholy isolation on the vast back of an elephant, whose maw led him by a chain of flowers. Our humble party modestly advanced just behind the elephant's tail. The performance of rites on the way seemed endless. We had to stop before every tree, every pagoda, every sacred tank and bush, and at last before a sacred cow. When we came back to the house of the bride it was 4 in the afternoon, and we had started a little after 6 in the morning. We all were utterly exhausted, and Miss X literally threatened to fall asleep on her feet. The indignant Sikh had left us long ago and had persuaded Mr. Y and Mulji, whom the colonel had nicknamed the Mute General, to keep him company. Our respected president was bathed in his own perspiration, and even Narayan the unchangeable yawned and sought consolation in a fan. But the Babu was simply astonishing. After a 9 hours walk under the sun, with his head unprotected, he looked fresher than ever, without a drop of sweat on his dark satin-like forehead. He showed his white teeth in an eternal smile and chaffed us all, reciting the diamond wedding of Stedman. We struggled against our fatigue and our desire to witness the last ceremony, after which the woman is forever cut off from the external world. It was just going to begin, and we kept our eyes and ears wide open. The bridegroom and the bride were placed before the altar. The officiating Brahmin tied their hands with some cuscus grass and led them 3 times round the altar. Then their hands were untied, and the Brahmin mumbled a mantram. When he had finished, the boy husband lifted his diminutive bride and carried her 3 times round the altar in his arms, then again 3 turns round the altar, but the boy preceding the girl, and she following him like an obedient slave. When this was over, the bridegroom was placed on a high chair by the entrance door, and the bride brought a basin of water, took off his shoes, and, having washed his feet, wiped them with her long hair. We learned that this was a very ancient custom. On the right side of the bridegroom sat his mother. The bride knelt before her also, and, having performed the same operation over her feet, she retired to the house. Then her mother came out of the crowd and repeated the same ceremony, but without using her hair as a towel. The young couple were married. The drums and the tom-toms rolled once more, and half-deaf we started for home. In the tent we found the Akali in the middle of a sermon, delivered for the edification of the mute general and Mr. Y. He was explaining to them the advantages of the Sikh religion and comparing it with the faith of the devil worshippers, as he called the Brahmins. It was too late to go to the caves, and, besides, we had had enough sights for one day. So we sat down to rest and to listen to the words of wisdom falling from the lips of the God's warrior. In my humble opinion, he was right in more than one thing. In his most imaginative moments, Satan himself could not have invented anything more unjust and more refinedly cruel than what was invented by these twice-born egotists in their relation to the weaker sex. An unconditioned civil death awaits her in case of widowhood, even if this sad fate befalls her when she is 2 or 3 years old. It is of no importance for the Brahmins if the marriage never actually took place. The goat sacrifice, at which the personal presence of the little girl is not even required, she being represented by the wretched victim, is considered binding for her. As for the man, not only is he permitted to have several lawful wives at a time, but he is even required by the law to marry again if his wife dies. Not to be unjust, I must mention that, with the exception of some vicious and depraved Rajas, we never heard of a Hindu availing himself of this privilege and having more than one wife. At the present time, the whole of Orthodox India is shaken by the struggle in favor of the remarriage of widows. This agitation was begun in Bombay by a few reformers and opponents of Brahmins. It is already 10 years since Mulji Thakur Singh and others raised this question, but we know only of 3 or 4 men who have dared as yet to marry widows. This struggle is carried on in silence and secrecy, but nevertheless it is fierce and obstinate. In the meanwhile, the fate of the widow is what the Brahmins wish it to be. As soon as the corpse of her husband is burned, the widow must shave her head and never let it grow again as long as she lives. Her bangles, necklaces and rings are broken to pieces and burned, together with her hair and her husband's remains. During the rest of her life she must wear nothing but white if she was less than 25 at her husband's death, and red if she was older. Temples, religious ceremonies, society, are closed to her forever. She has no right to speak to any of her relations, and no right to eat with them. She sleeps, eats and works separately. Her touch is considered impure for 7 years. If a man, going out on business, meets a widow, he goes home again, abandoning every pursuit, because to see a widow is accounted an evil omen. In the past all this was seldom practiced and concerned only the rich widows who refused to be burned, but now, since the Brahmins have been caught in the false interpretation of the Vedas with the criminal intention of appropriating the widow's wealth, they insist on the fulfillment of this cruel precept and make what once was the exception the rule. They are powerless against British law, and so they revenge themselves on the innocent and helpless women, whom fate has deprived of their natural protectors. Professor Wilson's demonstration of the means by which the Brahmins distorted the sense of the Vedas in order to justify the practice of widow burning is well worth mentioning. During the many centuries that this terrible practice prevailed, the Brahmins had appealed to a certain Vedic text for their justification and had claimed to be rigidly fulfilling the institutes of Manu, which contain for them the interpretation of Vedic law. When the East India Company's government first turned its attention to the suppression of sati, the whole country, from Cape Comorin to the Himalayas, rose in protest under the influence of the Brahmins. The English promised not to interfere in our religious affairs, and they must keep their word, was the general outcry. Never was India so near revolution as in those days. The English saw the danger and gave up the task. But Professor Wilson, the best Sanskritist of the time, did not consider the battle lost. He applied himself to the study of the most ancient MSS and gradually became convinced that the alleged precept did not exist in the Vedas, though in the laws of Manu it was quite distinct and had been translated accordingly by T. Colebrooke and other Orientalists. An attempt to prove to the fanatic population that Manu's interpretation was wrong would have been equivalent to an attempt to reduce water to powder. So Wilson set himself to study Manu and to compare the text of the Vedas with the text of this lawgiver. This was the result of his labors. The Rig Veda orders the Brahmin to place the widow side by side with the corpse, and then, after the performance of certain rites, to lead her down from the funeral pyre and to sing the following verse from Grihya Sutra. Arise, O woman. Return to the world of the living. Having gone to sleep by the dead, awake again. Long enough thou hast been a faithful wife to the one who made thee mother of his children. Then those present at the burning were to rub their eyes with collyrium, and the Brahmin to address to them the following verse. Approach, you married women, not widows, with your husbands bring ghee and butter. Let the mothers go up to the womb first, dressed in festive garments and costly adornments. The line before the last was misinterpreted by the Brahmins in the most skillful way. In Sanskrit it reads as follows. Arahantu Janeo Yana Majur Yanina Ajur literally means to the womb first. Having changed only one letter of the last word Ajur, first, in Sanskrit script, the Brahmins wrote instead an a, fires, in Sanskrit script, and so acquired the right to send the wretched widows Unina Anet to the womb of fire. It is difficult to find on the face of the world another such fiendish deception. The Vedas never permitted the burning of the widows, and there is a place in Taittiriya Aranyaka of the Yajur Veda where the brother of the deceased, or his disciple, or even a trusted friend, is recommended to say to the widow, whilst a pyre is set on fire, Arise, O woman. Do not lie down any more beside the lifeless corpse, return to the world of the living, and become the wife of the one who holds you by the hand and is willing to be your husband. This verse shows that during the Vedic period the remarriage of widows was allowed. Besides, in several places in the ancient books, pointed out to us by Swami Dayanand, we found orders to the widows to keep the ashes of the husband for several months after his death, and to perform over them certain final rituals. However, in spite of the scandal created by Professor Wilson's discovery, and of the fact that the Brahmins were put to shame before the double authority of the Vedas and of Manu, the custom of centuries proved so strong that some pious Hindu women still burn themselves whenever they can. Not more than 2 years ago the 4 widows of young Bahadur, the chief minister of Nepal, insisted upon being burned. Nepal is not under the British rule, and so the Anglo-Indian government had no right to interfere. The caves of Ba. At 4 o'clock in the morning we crossed the Vagri and Gurna, or rather, Comkalaris local, Shiva and Parvati. Probably, following the bad example of the average mortal husband and wife, this divine couple were engaged in a quarrel, even at this early hour of the day. They were frightfully rough, and our ferry, striking on something at the bottom, nearly upset us into the cold embrace of the god and his irate better half. Like all the cave temples of India, the Ba caverns are dug out in the middle of a vertical rock with the intention, as it seems to me, of testing the limits of human patience. Taking into consideration that such a height does not prevent either glamour or tigers reaching the caves, I cannot help thinking that the sole aim of the ascetic builders was to tempt weak mortals into the sin of irritation by the inaccessibility of their airy abodes. 72 steps, cut out in the rock and covered with thorny weeds and moss, are the beginning of the ascent to the Ba caves. Footmarks worn in the stone through centuries spoke of the numberless pilgrims who had come here before us. The roughness of the steps, with deep holes here and there, and thorns, added attractions to this ascent. Join to this a number of mountain springs exuding through the pores of the stone, and no one will be astonished if I say that we simply felt faint under the weight of life and our archaeological difficulties. The babu, who, taking off his slippers, scampered over the thorns as unconcernedly as if he had hoofs instead of vulnerable human heels, laughed at the helplessness of Europeans and only made us feel worse. But on reaching the top of the mountain we stopped grumbling, realizing at the first glance that we should receive our reward. We saw a whole enfilade of dark caves, through regular square openings, 6 feet wide. We felt awestruck with the gloomy majesty of this deserted temple. There was a curious ceiling over the square platform that once served as a veranda. There was also a portico with broken pillars hanging over our heads, and 2 rooms on each side, one with a broken image of some flat-nosed goddess, the other containing a Ganesha, but we did not stop to examine all this in detail. Ordering the torches to be lit, we stepped into the first hall. A damp breath as of the tomb met us. At our first word we all shivered. A hollow, prolonged echoing howl, dying away in the distance, shook the ancient vaults and made us all lower our voices to a whisper. The torch-bearers shrieked Devi, Devi, and, kneeling in the dust, performed a fervent puja in honor of the voice of the invisible goddess of the caves, in spite of the angry protestations of Narayan and of the god's warrior. The only light of the temple came from the entrance, and so 2/3 of it looked still gloomier by contrast. This hall, or the central temple, is very spacious, 84 feet square, and 16 feet high. 24 massive pillars form a square, 6 pillars at each side, including the corner ones, and 4 in the middle to prop up the center of the ceiling, otherwise it could not be kept from falling, as the mass of the mountain which presses on it from the top is much greater than in Karli or Elephanta. There are at least 3 different styles in the architecture of these pillars. Some of them are grooved in spirals, gradually and imperceptibly changing from round to 16-sided, then octagonal and square. Others, plain for the first third of their height, gradually finished under the ceiling by a most elaborate display of ornamentation, which reminds one of the Corinthian style. The third with a square plinth and semicircular friezes. Taking it all in all, they made a most original and graceful picture. Mr. Y, an architect by profession, assured us that he never saw anything more striking. He said he could not imagine by the aid of what instruments the ancient builders could accomplish such wonders. The construction of the Ba caves, as well as of all the cave temples of India, whose history is lost in the darkness of time, is ascribed by the European archaeologists to the Buddhists and by the native tradition to the Pandu brothers. Indian paleography protests in every one of its new discoveries against the hasty conclusions of the Orientalists. And much may be said against the intervention of Buddhists in this particular case. But I shall indicate only one particular. The theory which declares that all the cave temples of India are of Buddhist origin is wrong. The Orientalists may insist as much as they choose on the hypothesis that the Buddhists became again idol worshippers. It will explain nothing and contradicts the history of both Buddhists and Brahmins. The Brahmins began persecuting and banishing the Buddhists precisely because they had begun a crusade against idol worship. The few Buddhist communities who remained in India and deserted the pure, though maybe for a shallow observer somewhat atheistic teachings of Gautama Siddhartha, never joined Brahmanism, but coalesced with the Jainas and gradually became absorbed in them. Then why not suppose that if, amongst hundreds of Brahmanical gods, we find one statue of Buddha, it only shows that the masses of half-converts to Buddhism added this new god to the ancient Brahmanical temple. This would be much more sensible than to think that the Buddhists of the 2 centuries before and after the beginning of the Christian era dared to fill their temples with idols in defiance of the spirit of the reformer Gautama. The figures of Buddha are easily discerned in the swarm of heathen gods. Their position is always the same, and the palm of its right hand is always turned upwards, blessing the worshippers with 2 fingers. We examined almost every remarkable vihara of the so-called Buddhist temples and never met with one statue of Buddha which could not have been added in a later epoch than the construction of the temple. It does not matter whether it was a year or 1,000 years later. Not being perfectly self-confident in this matter, we always took the opinion of Mr. White, who, as I said before, was an experienced architect, and he invariably came to the conclusion that the Brahmanical idols formed a harmonic and genuine part of the whole, pillars, decorations, and the general style of the temple, whereas the statue of Buddha was an additional and discordant patch. Out of 30 or 40 caves of Ellora, all filled with idols, there is only one, the one called the Temple of the Trilokas, which contains nothing but statues of Buddha and of Ananda, his favorite disciple. Of course, in this case it would be perfectly right to think it is a Buddhist vihara. Most probably, some of the Russian archaeologists will protest against the opinions I maintain, that is to say, the opinions of the Hindu archaeologists, and will treat me as an ignoramus outraging science. In self-defense, and in order to show how unstable a ground to base one's opinions upon are the conclusions even of such a great authority as Mr. Ferguson, I must mention the following instance. This great architect, but very mediocre archaeologist, proclaimed at the very beginning of his scientific career that all the cave temples of Kanara, without exception, were built between the 5th and the 10th centuries. This theory became generally accepted when suddenly Dr. Bird found a brass plate in a certain Kanara monument called a tope. The plate announced in pure and distinct Sanskrit that this tope was erected as a homage to the old temple at the beginning of 245 of the Hindu astronomical Samvit era. According to Prinsep and Dr. Stevenson, this date coincides with 189 AD, and so it clearly settles the question of when the tope was built. But the question of the antiquity of the temple itself still remains open, though the inscription states that it was an old temple in 189 AD and contradicts the above-quoted opinion of Ferguson. However, this important discovery failed to shake Ferguson's equanimity. For him, ancient inscriptions are of no importance because, as he says, The antiquity of ruins must not be fixed on the basis of inscriptions, but on the basis of certain architectural canons and rules discovered by Mr. Ferguson in person. Fiat hypothesis, ruit coelum. And now I shall return to my narrative. Straight before the entrance a door leads to another hall, which is oblong, with hexagonal pillars and niches, containing statues in a tolerable state of preservation, goddesses 10 feet and gods 9 feet high. After this hall there is a room with an altar, which is a regular hexagon, having sides each 3 feet long, and protected by a cupola cut in the rock. Nobody was admitted here, except the initiates of the mysteries of the adytum. All round this room there are about 20 priest cells. Absorbed in the examination of the altar, we did not notice the absence of the colonel, till we heard his loud voice in the distance calling to us. "I have found a secret passage. Come along, let us find where it leads to." Torch in hand, the colonel was far ahead of us, and very eager to proceed, but each of us had a little plan of his own, and so we were reluctant to obey his summons. The babu took upon himself to answer for the whole party. "Take care, Colonel. This passage leads to the den of the glamour mind the tigers." But once fairly started on the way to discoveries, our president was not to be stopped. Nolens volens we followed him. He was right, he had made a discovery, and on entering the cell we saw a most unexpected tableau. By the opposite wall stood 2 torch bearers with their flaming torches, as motionless as if they were transformed into stone caryatides, and from the wall, about 5 feet above the ground, protruded 2 legs clad in white trousers. There was no body to them, the body had disappeared, and but that the legs were shaken by a convulsive effort to move on, we might have thought that the wicked goddess of this place had cut the colonel into 2 halves, and having caused the upper half instantly to evaporate, had stuck the lower half to the wall as a kind of trophy. "What has become of you, Mr. President? Where are you?" were our alarmed questions. Instead of an answer, the legs were convulsed still more violently and soon disappeared completely, after which we heard the voice of the colonel, as if coming through a long tube. "A room, a secret cell, be quick. I see a whole row of rooms, confound it. My torch is out. Bring some matches and another torch." But this was easier said than done. The torch-bearers refused to go on. As it was, they were already frightened out of their wits. Miss X glanced with apprehension at the wall thickly covered with soot, and then at her pretty gown. Mr. Y sat down on a broken pillar and said he would go no farther, preferring to have a quiet smoke in the company of the timid torch-bearers. There were several vertical steps cut in the wall, and on the floor we saw a large stone of such a curiously irregular shape that it struck me that it could not be natural. The quick-eyed babu was not long in discovering its peculiarities and said he was sure it was the stopper of the secret passage. We all hurried to examine the stone most minutely and discovered that, though it imitated as closely as possible the irregularity of the rock, its undersurface bore evident traces of workmanship and had a kind of hinge to be easily moved. The hole was about 3 feet high, but not more than 2 feet wide. The muscular god's warrior was the first to follow the colonel. He was so tall that when he stood on a broken pillar the opening came down to the middle of his breast, and so he had no difficulty in transporting himself to the upper story. The slender babu joined him with a single monkey-like jump. Then, With the Akali pulling from above and Narayan pushing from below, I safely made the passage, though the narrowness of the hole proved most disagreeable, and the roughness of the rock left considerable traces on my hands. However, trying archaeological explorations may be for a person afflicted by an unusually fine presence, I felt perfectly confident that with two such Hercules-like helpers as Narayan and Ram Ranjit Das, the ascent of the Himalayas would be perfectly possible for me. Miss X came next, under the escort of Mulji, but Mr. Y stayed behind. The secret cell was a room of 12 feet square. Straight above the black hole in the floor there was another in the ceiling, but this time we did not discover any stopper. The cell was perfectly empty with the exception of black spiders as big as crabs. Our apparition, and especially the bright light of the torches, maddened them. Panic-stricken they ran in hundreds over the walls, rushed down, and tumbled on our heads, tearing their thin ropes in their inconsiderate haste. The first movement of Miss X was to kill as many as she could. But the four Hindus protested strongly and unanimously. The old lady remonstrated in an offended voice. "I thought that at least you, Mulji, were a reformer, but you are as superstitious as any idol worshipper." "Above everything I am a Hindu," answered the mute general. "And the Hindus, as you know, consider it sinful before nature and before their own consciences to kill an animal put to flight by the strength of man, be it even poisonous. As to the spiders, in spite of their ugliness, they are perfectly harmless. I am sure all this is because you think you will transmigrate into a black spider," she replied, her nostrils trembling with anger. "I cannot say I do," retorted Mulji, "but if all the English ladies are as unkind as you, I should rather be a spider than an Englishman." This lively answer coming from the usually taciturn Mulji was so unexpected that we could not help laughing. But to our great discomfiture Miss X was seriously angry and, under pretext of giddiness, said she would rejoin Mr. Y below. Her constant bad spirits were becoming trying for our cosmopolitan little party, and so we did not press her to stay. As to us, we climbed through the second opening, but this time under the leadership of Narayan. He disclosed to us that this place was not new to him, he had been here before, and confided to us that similar rooms, one on the top of the other, go up to the summit of the mountain. Then, he said, they take a sudden turn and descend gradually to a whole underground palace, which is sometimes temporarily inhabited. Wishing to leave the world for a while and to spend a few days in isolation, the Raj yogis find perfect solitude in this underground abode. Our president looked askance at Narayan through his spectacles, but did not find anything to say. The Hindus also received this information in perfect silence. The second cell was exactly like the first one. We easily discovered the hole in its ceiling and reached the third cell. There we sat down for a while. I felt that breathing was becoming difficult to me, but I thought I was simply out of breath and tired, and so did not mention to my companions that anything was wrong. The passage to the fourth cell was almost stopped by earth mixed with little stones, and the gentlemen of the party were busy clearing it out for about 20 minutes. Then we reached the fourth cell. Narayan was right, the cells were one straight over the other, and the floor of the one formed the ceiling of the other. The fourth cell was in ruins. Two broken pillars lying one on the other presented a very convenient stepping stone to the fifth story. But the colonel stopped our zeal by saying that now was the time to smoke the pipe of deliberation after the fashion of Red Indians. If Narayan is not mistaken, he said, this going up and up may continue till tomorrow morning. I am not mistaken, said Narayan almost solemnly. But since my visit here I have heard that some of these passages were filled with earth, so that every communication is stopped, and, if I remember rightly, we cannot go further than the next story. In that case there is no use trying to go any further. If the ruins are so shaky as to stop the passages, it would be dangerous for us. I never said the passages were stopped by the hand of time, they did it on purpose. Who they? Do you mean Glam? By the dim light of the half-extinguished torches we saw that Narayan's lips trembled and that his face grew pale as he spoke. The colonel coughed, rearranged his spectacles and remained silent for a while. My dear Narayan, at last said the colonel, I do not want to believe that your intention is to make fun of our credulity. But I can't believe either that you seriously mean to assure us that any living creature, be it an animal or an ascetic, could exist in a place where there is no air. I paid special attention to the fact, and so I am perfectly sure I am not mistaken. There is not a single bat in these cells, which shows that there is a lack of air. And just look at our torches. You see how dim they are growing. I am sure that on climbing 2 or 3 more rooms like this, we should be suffocated. And in spite of all these facts, I speak the truth, repeated Narayan. The caves further on are inhabited by them. And I have seen them with my own eyes. The colonel grew thoughtful and stood glancing at the ceiling in a perplexed and undecided way. We all kept silent, breathing heavily. Let us go back, suddenly shouted the Akali. My nose is bleeding. At this very moment I felt a strange and unexpected sensation, and I sank heavily on the ground. In a second I felt an indescribably delicious heavenly sense of rest, in spite of a dull pain beating in my temples. I vaguely realized that I had really fainted, and that I should die if not taken out into the open air. I could not lift my finger, I could not utter a sound, and, in spite of it, there was no fear in my soul, nothing but an apathetic but indescribably sweet feeling of rest and a complete inactivity of all the senses except hearing. A moment came when even this sense forsook me, because I remember that I listened with imbecile intentness to the dead silence around me. Is this death? Was my indistinct wondering thought. Then I felt as if mighty wings were fanning me. Kind wings, caressing, kind wings, were the recurring words in my brain, like the regular movements of a pendulum, and interiorly under an unreasoning impulse, I laughed at these words. Then I experienced a new sensation. I rather knew than felt that I was lifted from the floor and fell down and down some unknown precipice amongst the hollow rollings of a distant thunderstorm. Suddenly a loud voice resounded near me. And this time I think I did not hear, but felt it. There was something palpable in this voice, something that instantly stopped my helpless descent and kept me from falling any further. This was a voice I knew well, but whose voice it was I could not in my weakness remember. In what way I was dragged through all these narrow holes will remain an eternal mystery for me. I came to myself on the veranda below, fanned by fresh breezes, and as suddenly as I had fainted above in the impure air of the cell. When I recovered completely, the first thing I saw was a powerful figure clad in white, with a raven black Rajput beard, anxiously leaning over me. As soon as I recognized the owner of this beard, I could not abstain from expressing my feelings by a joyful exclamation. "Where do you come from?" It was our friend Thakur Gulab Lal Singh, who, having promised to join us in the northwest provinces, now appeared to us in Ba, as if falling from the sky or coming out of the ground. But my unfortunate accident, and the pitiable state of the rest of the daring explorers, were enough to stop any further questions and expressions of astonishment. On one side of me the frightened Miss X, using my nose as a cork for her sal volatile bottle. On the other, the god's warrior covered with blood as if returning from a battle with the Afghans. Further on, poor Mulji with a dreadful headache. Narayan and the colonel, happily for our party, did not experience anything worse than a slight vertigo. As to the babu, no carbonic acid gas could inconvenience his wonderful Bengali nature. He said he was safe and comfortable enough, but awfully hungry. At last the outpour of entangled exclamations and unintelligible explanations stopped, and I collected my thoughts and tried to understand what had happened to me in the cave. Narayan was the first to notice that I had fainted and hastened to drag me back to the passage. And this very moment they all heard the voice of Gulab Singh coming from the upper cell. "Tum hai hanika kaya kam tha? What on earth brought you here?" Even before they recovered from their astonishment, he ran quickly past them and, descending to the cell beneath, called to them to pass him down the by, sister. This passing down of such a solid object as my body, and the picture of the proceeding, vividly imagined, made me laugh heartily, and I felt sorry I had not been able to witness it. Handing him over their half-dead load, they hastened to join the Thakur, but he contrived to do without their help, though how he did it they were at a loss to understand. By the time they succeeded in getting through one passage, Gulab Singh was already at the next one, in spite of the heavy burden he carried, and they never were in time to be of any assistance to him. The colonel, whose main feature is the tendency to go into the details of everything, could not conceive by what proceedings the Thakur had managed to pass my almost lifeless body so rapidly through all these narrow holes. He could not have thrown her down the passage before going in himself, for every single bone of her body would have been broken, mused the colonel. And it is still less possible to suppose that, descending first himself, he dragged her down afterwards. It is simply incomprehensible. These questions harassed him for a long time afterwards, until they became something like the puzzle. Which was created first, the egg or the bird? As to the Thakur, when closely questioned, he shrugged his shoulders and answered that he really did not remember. He said that he simply did whatever he could to get me out into the open air, that all our traveling companions were there to watch his proceedings, he was under their eyes all the time, and that in circumstances when every second is precious people do not think, but act. But all these questions arose only in the course of the day. As to the time directly after I was laid down on the veranda, there were other things to puzzle all our party. No one could understand how the Thakur happened to be on the spot exactly when his help was most needed, nor where he came from, and everyone was anxious to know. On the veranda they found me lying on a carpet, with the Thakur busy restoring me to my senses, and Miss X with her eyes wide open at the Thakur, whom she decidedly believed to be a materialized ghost. However, the explanations our friend gave us seemed perfectly satisfactory, and at first did not strike us as unnatural. He was in Hardwar when Swami Dayanand sent us the letter which postponed our going to him. On arriving at Kanjua by the Inder Railway, he had visited Holker and, learning that we were so near, he decided to join us sooner than he had expected. He had come to Ba yesterday evening, but knowing that we were to start for the caves early in the morning, he went there before us and simply was waiting for us in the caves. "There is the whole mystery for you," said he. "The whole mystery?" exclaimed the colonel. "Did you know, then, beforehand that we would discover the cells, or what?" "No, I did not. I simply went there myself because it is a long time since I saw them last. Examining them took me longer than I expected, and so I was too late to meet you at the entrance." Probably the Thakur Sahib was enjoying the freshness of the air in the cells, suggested the mischievous Babu, showing all his white teeth in a broad grin. Our president uttered an energetic exclamation. "Exactly. How on earth did I not think of that before? You could not possibly have any breathing air in the cells above the one you found us in, and, besides, how did you reach the fifth cell when the entrance of the fourth was nearly stopped and we had to dig it out? There are other passages leading to them. I know all the turns and corridors of these caves, and everyone is free to choose his way," answered Gulab Singh, and I thought I saw a look of intelligence pass between him and Narayan, who simply cowered under his fiery eyes. "However, let us go to the cave where breakfast is ready for us. Fresh air will do all of you good." On our way we met with another cave, 20 or 30 steps south from the veranda, but the Thakur did not let us go in, fearing new accidents for us. So we descended the stone steps I have already mentioned, and after descending about 200 steps towards the foot of the mountain, made a short reascent again and entered the dining room, as the Babu denominated it. In my role of interesting invalid, I was carried to it, sitting in my folding chair, which never left me in all my travels. This temple is much the less gloomy of the two, in spite of considerable signs of decay. The frescoes of the ceiling are better preserved than in the first temple. The walls, the tumble-down pillars, the ceiling, and even the interior rooms, which were lighted by ventilators cut through the rock, were once covered by a varnished stucco, the secret of which is now known only to the madrasas, and which gives the rock the appearance of pure marble. We were met by the Thakur's 4 servants, whom we remembered since our stay in Karli, and who bowed down in the dust to greet us. The carpets were spread, and the breakfast ready. Every trace of carbonic acid had left our brains, and we sat down to our meal in the best of spirits. Our conversation soon turned to the hardware Mela, which our unexpectedly recovered friend had left exactly 5 days ago. All the information we got from Gulab Lal Singh was so interesting that I wrote it down at the first opportunity. After a few weeks we visited Hardwar ourselves, and since I saw it, my memory has never grown tired of recalling the charming picture of its lovely situation. It is as near a primitive picture of earthly paradise as anything that can be imagined. Every 12th year, which the Hindus call Kumbha, the planet Jupiter enters the constellation of Aquarius, and this event is considered very propitious for the beginning of the religious fair, for which this day is accordingly fixed by the astrologers of the pagodas. This gathering attracts the representatives of all sects, as I said before, from princes and maharajas down to the last fakir. The former come for the sake of religious discussions, the latter simply to plunge into the waters of Ganges at its very source, which must be done at a certain propitious hour, fixed also by the position of the stars. Ganges is a name invented in Europe. The natives always say Ganga and consider this river to belong strictly to the feminine sex. Ganges is sacred in the eyes of the Hindus because she is the most important of all the fostering goddesses of the country and a daughter of the old Himavat, Himalaya, from whose heart she springs for the salvation of the people. That is why she is worshipped and why the city of Hardwar, built at her very source, is so sacred. Hardwar is written Haryavara, the doorway of the sun god or Krishna, and is also often called Gangadvara, the doorway of Ganga. There is still a third name of the same town, which is the name of a certain ascetic Kapila, or rather Kapila, who once sought salvation on this spot and left many miraculous traditions. The town is situated in a charming flowery valley at the foot of the southern slope of the Sivalik Ridge between two mountain chains. In this valley, raised 1,024 feet above the sea level, the northern nature of the Himalayas struggles with the tropical growth of the plains, and, in their efforts to excel each other, they have created the most delightful of all the delightful corners of India. The town itself is a quaint collection of castle-like turrets of the most fantastical architecture, of ancient viharas, of wooden fortresses, so gaily painted that they look like toys, of pagodas, with loopholes and overhanging curved little balconies, and all this overgrown by such abundance of roses, dahlias, aloes and blossoming cactuses that it is hardly possible to tell a door from a window. The granite foundations of many houses are laid almost in the bed of the river, and so, during 4 months of the year, they are half covered with water. And behind this handful of scattered houses, higher up the mountain slope, crowd snow-white, stately temples. Some of them are low, with thick walls, wide wings and gilded cupolas. Others rise in majestical many-storied towers, others again with shapely pointed roofs, which look like the spires of a bell tower. Strange and capricious is the architecture of these temples, the like of which is not to be seen anywhere else. They look as if they had suddenly dropped from the snowy abodes of the mountain spirits above, standing there in the shelter of the mother mountain, and timidly peeping over the head of the small town below at their own images reflected in the pure, untroubled waters of the sacred river. Here the Ganges is not yet polluted by the dirt and the sins of her many million adorers. Releasing her worshippers, cleansed from her icy embrace, the pure maiden of the mountains carries her transparent waves through the burning plains of Hindostan, and only 348 miles lower down, on passing through Kanpur, do her waters begin to grow thicker and darker, while, on reaching Benares, they transform themselves into a kind of peppery pea soup. Once, while talking to an old Hindu, who tried to convince us that his compatriots are the cleanest nation in the world, we asked him, "Why is it then that, in the less populous places, the Ganges is pure and transparent, whilst in Benares, especially towards evening, it looks like a mass of liquid mud?" "Oh Sahibs," answered he mournfully, "it is not the dirt of our bodies, as you think. It is not even the blackness of our sins. That the Devi, goddess, washes away her waves are black with the sorrow and shame of her children. Her feelings are sad and sorrowful, hidden suffering, burning pain and humiliation, despair and shame at her own helplessness, have been her lot for many past centuries. She has suffered all this till her waters have become waves of black bile. Her waters are poisoned and black, but not from physical causes. She is our mother, and how could she help resenting the degradation we have brought ourselves to in this dark age? The sorrowful, poetical allegory made us feel very keenly for the poor old man, but, however great our sympathy, we could not but suppose that probably the woes of the maiden Ganga do not affect her sources. In Hardwar the color of Ganges is crystal aquamarina, and the waters run gaily murmuring to the shore reeds about the wonders they saw on their way from the Himalayas. The beautiful river is the greatest and the purest of goddesses in the eyes of the Hindus, and many are the honors given to her in Hardwar. Besides the Mela celebrated once every 12 years, there is a month in every year when the pilgrims flock together to the Harikapira, stairs of Vishnu. Whosoever succeeds in throwing himself first into the river, at the appointed day, hour and moment, will not only expiate all his sins, but also have all bodily sufferings removed. This zeal to be first is so great that, owing to a badly constructed and narrow stair leading to the water, it used to cost many lives yearly, until, in 1819, the East India Company, taking pity upon the pilgrims, ordered this ancient relic to be removed, and a new stairway, 100 feet wide and consisting of 60 steps, to be constructed. The month when the waters of the Ganges are most salutary falls, according to the Brahmanical computation, between March 12 and April 10, and is called Chaitra. The worst of it is that the waters are at their best only at the first moment of a certain propitious hour, indicated by the Brahmins, and which sometimes happens to be midnight. You can fancy what it must be when this moment comes, in the midst of a crowd which exceeds 2 millions. In 1819 more than 400 people were crushed to death. But even after the new stairs were constructed, the goddess Ganga has carried away on her virgin bosom many a disfigured corpse of her worshippers. Nobody pitied the drowned, on the contrary, they were envied. Whoever happens to be killed during this purification by bathing is sure to go straight to Swarga, heaven. In 1760, the two rival brotherhoods of Sannyasis and Barajas had a regular battle amongst them on the sacred day of Purbi, the last day of the religious fair. The Barajas were conquered, and there were 18,000 people slaughtered. And in 1796, proudly narrated our warlike friend the Akali, the pilgrims from Punjab, all of them Sikhs, desiring to punish the insolence of the Hossains, killed here about 500 of these heathens. My own grandfather took part in the fight. Later on we verified this in the Gazetteer of India, and the god's warrior was cleared of every suspicion of exaggeration and boasting. In 1879, however, no one was drowned or crushed to death, but a dreadful epidemic of cholera broke out. We were disgusted at this impediment, but had to keep at a distance in spite of our impatience to see Hardwar. And unable to behold distant summits of old Himavat ourselves, we had in the meanwhile to be contented with what we could hear about him from other people. So we talked long after our breakfast under the cave vault was finished. But our talk was not so gay as it might have been, because we had to part with Ram Ranjit Das, who was going to Bombay. The worthy Sikh shook hands with us in the European way, and then raising his right hand gave us his blessing, after the fashion of all the followers of Nanaka. But when he approached the tacker to take leave of him, his countenance suddenly changed. This change was so evident that we all noted it. The tacker was sitting on the ground leaning on a saddle, which served him as a cushion. The Akali did not attempt either to give him his blessing or to shake hands with him. The proud expression of his face also changed, and showed confusion and anxious humility, instead of the usual self-respect and self-sufficiency. The brave Sikh knelt down before the tacker, and instead of the ordinary namaste, "Salutation to you," whispered reverently, as if addressing the guru of the Golden Lake. "I am your servant, Sadhu Sahib. Give me your blessing." Without any apparent reason or cause, we all felt self-conscious and ill at ease, as if guilty of some indiscretion. But the face of the mysterious Rajput remained as calm and as dispassionate as ever. He was looking at the river before this scene took place, and slowly moved his eyes to the Akali, who lay prostrated before him. Then he touched the head of the Sikh with his index finger, and rose with the remark that we also had better start at once, because it was getting late. We drove in our carriage, moving very slowly because of the deep sand which covers all this locality, and the tacker followed us on horseback all the way. He told us the epic legends of Hardwar and Rajasthan, of the great deeds of the Hari Kulas, the heroic princes of the solar race. Hari means son, and Kula family. Some of the Rajput princes belong to this family, and the Maharanas of Udaipur are especially proud of their astronomical. The name of Hari Kula gives to some Orientalists ground to suppose that a member of this family emigrated to Egypt in the remote epoch of the first pharaonic dynasties, and that the ancient Greeks, borrowing the name as well as the traditions, thus formed their legends about the mythological Hercules. It is believed that the ancient Egyptians adored the Sphinx under the name of Hari Mukh, or the sun on the horizon. On the mountain chain which fringes Kashmir on the north, 13,000 feet above the sea, there is a huge summit, which is exactly like a head, and which bears the name of Haramak. This name is also met with in the most ancient of the Puranas. Besides, popular tradition considers this Himalayan stone head to be the image of the setting sun. Is it possible, then, that all these coincidences are only accidental? And why is it that the Orientalists will not give it more serious attention? It seems to me that this is a rich soil for future research, and that it is no more to be explained by mere chance than the fact that both Egypt and India held the cow sacred, and that the ancient Egyptians had the same religious horror of killing certain animals as the modern Hindus. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.